All right, Jordan, we are streaming on YouTube and live in eScribe as well.
Great, thank you. All right, good afternoon. I will call the Land Use and Planning Committee to order. And as has been typical, this is a virtual meeting, whereas John Oliver says we're still joining you from this blank void. We have, for roll call, we have Becerra, Harp, Hess, Cheryl, Von Lossberg, and West present, so we don't have a quorum yet. And we have no public attendees, and we have planning board interviews today, and our first interview is at 2:25. So we'll just go ahead and recess until 2:20-ish and check back in. Let's just check back in a couple minutes before 2:25, and we'll get started with the agenda. Okay, I think I'll call us back to order and do a little introductory, just do a little introduction to the planning board process, I guess. We are going to be interviewing for one alternate position on the planning board, and there are 4 applicants. We have two interviews today, and we'll have 2 hopefully next week. So we won't be making any decisions today. Today we have Megan Robson and Erin Miller, and Ms. Robson should be joining us here shortly. I guess other orders of business, I'll note for the record that we do not have any members of the public in attendance at this point, and we haven't. There's no public comment on non-agenda items. We also don't have a quorum right now, so we're not able to approve minutes. So we'll hold those till when we do, we'll stand by and wait for our first applicant. Process-wise, I was going to just go through all the questions because it seems a little easier than going around, unless anyone wants to try to orchestrate that juggling. Okay. All right. Okay, our first interviewee is here, and she's rejoining the meeting. Megan, I think okay. Looks like you are in the meeting now. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, yeah, I can.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us. This is a subset of the Land Use and Planning Committee, and it's good to see you again, Megan. We're going to go through for the planning board interview. We're going to go through a set of about 8 questions, and we can just dive right in if you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay, awesome. So first of all, please introduce yourself and feel free to highlight any useful experiences, knowledge, or perspectives that you would bring to the planning board.
Hi. Oh, okay. So my name is Megan Robson, and I'm an agent with Glacier Sotheby's here in town. Additionally, work for or with Mary Stranahan and John McGee at Good Works and High Stakes on a really, really limited basis. And let's see, have been a graduate. I think Heather, we're calling them graduates of of the city. What's our official name? I have a tea towel, but what's the official name?
Local Government Citizens Academy.
Local Government Citizens Academy. I didn't want to say the wrong thing. And then additionally was on the city advisory committee for the TED and subdivision working group. So that's just a little bit of background.
Great, thank you. The planning board, as you know, advises the city council and the board of county commissioners on land use issues. Planning board members are asked to weigh in on the growth policy, the zoning ordinance, and subdivision regulations. What about this work appeals to you? Are there particular issues that you hope to address?
You know, I wouldn't say necessarily that there's particular issues that I hope to address. I really, really would just like to learn more about what our goals are as a city, and how our policies and procedures are, I guess, interpreted and aiding those goals or otherwise. You know, I think that, and the work that this board does is really, really critical, super important, really interesting, and has such far-reaching, I guess has such far-reaching impact that I just think it's really intriguing, and you know, it's very interesting to be kind of the alternate, right? Because I think it allows you to kind of step into a situation where you get to learn more about it before you really dive completely in, and are, you know, being asked to, you know, to vote on things that have critical impact to Missoula. You know, I think everybody's heard at this point in time how, you know, wildly out of step the real estate market is. And, you know, I would love to see if there's something that, you know, could be done about that. But obviously I know that there's plenty of people that are working on that exact issue. So, you know, I'm hopeful to just learn and to be a part of the process, and hopeful that if I have any sort of access to information or otherwise that can be helpful for, you know, the committee as a whole, that I can provide that.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, rezone requests can be very contentious. Please describe your approach to reviewing a development proposal that seems to comply with the growth policy and other relevant regulations, but is opposed by a large amount of testimony to the board. How would you weigh testimony geographically and otherwise?
You know, I think that, and this is really hard, and we talked about this a lot when we talked about TEDs and subdivisions, you know, and just how to weigh the concerns of a neighborhood or weigh the concerns of the public against, you know, what is actually allowable under zoning, and, you know, what's allowable or what could be allowable, you know, and I think that it's always really complicated, because I would love a world where there's unlimited land and there's unlimited ability to do all kinds of things, but we just know that we're not in that. That isn't us. You know, and I think that Missoula is specifically really interesting because it's geographically constrained. You know, more so, I'm from Billings, and what we've seen in Billings is that it just sprawls and just keeps going and going and going and going. And that's not something that Missoula can do. So I think that, yes, these things do get contentious, and yes, there is certainly issues that come about, and I think it's really great to listen to that feedback and try to understand the feelings, I guess, behind that, and where those feelings are based. But at the end of the day, it's not my job to make the rules, I think. You know, that's a public process, and so I think that you really have to be careful to not necessarily let that influence above and beyond what the rules allow or what the process should be. And I know, I mean, I know it gets heated, and I know that we all want parks, we all want parking, we all want open spaces, we all want ag land, we all want all of those things. But we also need places for people to live. So it's a challenging and tricky balance.
Sure, thank you. A major tenet of the our Missoula growth policy is the concept of focusing inward. And the idea of focus inward is to direct new development into already developed areas in the community where services, employment centers, shopping, schools, and infrastructure already exist. Can you please describe the trade-offs between infill and greenfield development? And then there's a couple of follow-up questions. Maybe I'll just read them all now so that you can just take whichever ones you'd like. Is infill development, first of all, is infill development a good idea? If so, do you have any thoughts on how to encourage or incentivize infill development? And then secondly, what factors should be considered for land use and growth in the urban fringe? Land in the county, but adjacent to or near the city.
Okay, I'm going to chunk that off as best as I can, but I might have to help you, or might have to ask you to help me to remember the entire question.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I actually work with a couple of folks who focus on infill development and do kind of smaller infill projects. And that's kind of their, their MO is to identify homes where it's possible to, they do a lot of lot splitting. So, basically a backyard home or infill development in the alley where it is permitted by zoning. They have not had to or gone through the process of doing a rezone at this point in time. And I think that there's a ton of benefits to that. And I also, living on a street where that is happening in my neighborhood, I mean, we're zoned RM145, and so we have the ability to split those lots and do that backyard development, and it is actually a very, it's a very good zone, I think, for that kind of thing. There's a trade-off. I mean, it is a little bit strange. My neighbors did it, a year and a half ago. They put a house up in their backyard. And so, whereas when we used to walk out and see kind of more open sky, we now walk out and see a house. It's 2 houses over from us, but it's there. And I think that change is always kind of scary. At first, right? And then I think you get to a point where you feel a little bit better about it. But I struggle with, not with infill development. I think infill development can be great and can be really, really useful. I struggle with the idea that we're just so critically behind in providing inventory in this market that I think that any ability that we have to try to creatively address those issues. And again, being in a community that is geographically limited, I mean, we have mountains and we have rivers, and we have to figure out a way to make that work and to be able to get people close to the services that they need to be close to. And that goes to a larger question about zoning and about the different zones and what that looks like. But, in the neighborhoods where it's been identified that density is appropriate, I think infill can be really, really valuable. And I think it can be a really great way to provide housing that is a little bit more affordable, or at least attainable. I mean, affordable is kind of gone at this point in time, but attainable is still potentially out there in those kind of creative land use situations.
Sure. Do you have any ideas on how to encourage or incentivize infill?
I know what the folks that I work with kind of run up against, and those are some pretty challenging conversations in, the long haul. I think that, and it's things that you have to be really careful with, and you have to balance really carefully to not, overpopulate a neighborhood and get it to the point where it's no longer sustainable. But I think that parking is always a huge thing, and I think that doing whatever we can do to encourage, not necessarily to encourage less parking, but maybe just encouraging less cars, is great. Biking, public transportation, I think that we're doing a really good job with, public transportation and with the ability to hop on a bus and go pretty much anywhere. I think that's really forward thinking, and that's helpful in the long run. But parking is one of the things that we always run into, and then just the understanding of how to navigate, especially a townhome process, which can be really, really complicated. I think that there's definitely a lot of opportunity out there to do more of these kind of infill projects. But it certainly is something that is not easy or necessarily intuitive to go through that process unless you've done it already. So some education on that would probably be incredibly helpful.
Yeah. On the greenfield side, what should we be considering as far as land use and growth in the urban fringe, or that, sort of the greenfield immediately adjacent to the city?
I read, I think recently Neva had written a letter to the editor about ag land and about, being able to provide food in places where, obviously local food is important too. And it's just a really, really challenging balance. And that's something that I think that every community is going to struggle with. I think that the best thing that we can possibly do for people is just meet like absolute basic needs, right? Like people need a place to live, and they need food to eat. And, sometimes those things are in direct competition. So I think having a long-term growth plan, having, a really concrete idea of what the city of Missoula goals are is really important. And then just looking at those projects and figuring out how does this fit into that long-term plan, and how does this fit into a bigger picture is something that, I think every time you're going to have to come up against. Sorry, I know that's not really an answer, but it seems like it's kind of case by case, and what actually makes the most sense, for the most people, I guess.
No, absolutely. I appreciate the answer. Our Missoula growth policy was adopted with broad public support, but in contrast, the planning board and the city council have reviewed numerous development proposals that actualize the growth policy and help implement the growth policy, but are extraordinarily contentious. Why do you think this is the case?
I think that I think sometimes it's hard to, and I mean, this is kind of a really weird example, but I think a lot of times when I walk a client through a house and it's not completed yet, there's a struggle, there's a disconnect there of being able to visualize what that final product actually looks like. And it's really easy to get caught up in the details and to get caught up in the idea that you don't know what this thing is going to be, and you don't know how it's going to impact you directly. And I think that sometimes it's great as long as it's not in our neighborhood, right? It's great if it's somewhere else. And then once it comes into your own neighborhood, then I think that sometimes people get very, very frustrated and concerned about what the impact of that is going to be. I'd be super interested to talk to people about like a year after something has happened, if they were really, really, really opposed to it at that point in time, and what fears and thoughts that they had about those projects actually came to pass, and what things were, maybe not as bad as they thought that it might be. But I think it's just that fear of the unknown, and it's fear of how it's going to impact you and your own neighborhood, and what it's going to do. I think people are very, very tied to their homes, as they should be. I mean, it's one of your largest investments. It's your home. It's a place you go home to every day, and if that is being threatened, or they're afraid that that's going to impact the resale of their house, or just their comfort in being there, I think that gets really emotional very quickly, which is understandable. I mean, it's understandable to have very strong feelings about the place that you live. So I guess that's probably part of it, is just not knowing what that impact is really going to look like.
Yeah, and that concept of the year after is interesting to me, and I wonder, just as a follow-up, if when development proposals come forward, do you think that there's a way to communicate those, or to provide public notice, or to do something that might sort of help with that problem, I guess, at the time of the proposal?
I think it would be really interesting to go back and to look back and maybe do some research into some of these areas where there were contentious public proposals, and see, how the neighborhood feels about that at that point in time, and if it's better, or worse, like what actually came of that was valid, what came of it that wasn't valid, what was the, real like dig-in analysis to what could have been done better, how could it have been communicated better. But I think it really is, it's just going to be super challenging for people to conceptualize something that doesn't actually exist yet, or to just try to understand what something could potentially look like, and then balancing the need for making your neighborhood feel like it's always felt, and introducing some of these new concepts to neighborhoods and areas, I think is going to be a very, very challenging thing. But I think that the number one thing that I always say about these kind of conversations is that people don't necessarily, like, feelings are valid, right? I mean, even if you're coming from a place that is not totally in the same, I guess, ballpark, the way that someone is feeling at that point in time is valid, and trying to get to the root of those feelings and trying to get to the root of those fears, I think is important, to just figure out, like, maybe there is something there, and we can't just dismiss things completely out of hand and say, absolutely no way, there's this is just totally irrational, right? Like, it's important to understand why people feel the way they do.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you describe the relationship between land use and transportation as you see it?
That's a pretty broad question. Sorry. I mean, I think transportation is an absolutely critical component to land use. I mean, I think that if you are, they have to go hand in hand, because if you, whatever's happening in an area, the transportation has to be adequate to serve that area. So I think that there's, really, really a ton of overlap there into making sure that infrastructure and the public works are appropriate for what is being used, for the land. Is that kind of that question?
Yeah, that's helpful. The last real substantive question, I guess, is are there any changes based on what you know about the planning board? Are there any changes that you would like to see in how the planning board does business or in the laws that it applies?
No, I mean, I think it's really, really easy to sit on something from the outside and to say, I would do this, I would do this, I would do this, I would do this. And I think that a better way to approach it is to really get a deep understanding of why things are done the way that they're done. Because full stop, there are billions and trillions and zillions of things that I don't know. And I know that there is a ton of unknown. And, I just really hope that I can be helpful in that process and be able to provide a perspective that, is useful, and to be rational in decision making, and to be a good partner to the other folks on the committee. And I don't want to come in and just say, like, I think we need to upend everything and change everything. I think it's really important to get some exposure to that first, to figure out what's happening that's working great, and what are the things that might need some help. And if there's a way that I can be helpful in that, I think that that's incredibly beneficial. I would love to do that. I'm a helper, so that's what I want to try to do.
Great. Lastly, the planning board meets on the first and third Tuesdays of the month. Lately, they've been adding some kind of ad hoc second and fourth Tuesdays because of the workload, but they generally begin at 7 p.m. Does your schedule generally accommodate this meeting time? And do you generally have time to review staff reports and other materials prior to meetings?
Wouldn't it be terrible if we went through this whole process and I was like, oh yeah, Tuesdays don't work for me? Like, that's just, it's full stop.
You should ask that at the front.
I'd be happy. The Tuesdays are great. Evenings are actually really good. We do a lot of work during the day up until about 6 o'clock usually, but usually at that point we have time. And I am a terrible sleeper, so I enjoy reading things at night, and that would probably be when I would be able to review materials.
Rezoning applications, that's a good bedtime reading.
I'm so excited. It's so much fun. I can't wait.
And then the last one is, as you know, this is an alternate position. So planning board alternates attend meetings and participate in discussion, but they only vote in the absence of full members. And just want to confirm that you're comfortable with that.
I just think that that's the greatest thing since sliced bread. get to be a part of the process and hopefully helpful and not necessarily have to make all the decisions, especially for somebody who's relatively new to this. That's pretty exciting.
Sounds good. So you're our first of 4 interviews, and those are gonna span this week and next. So the process from here is that we will complete the interviews, and then we'll deliberate as a committee and make an appointment. But it'll be early May before you hear back. So
Okay.
Are there, my colleagues, any follow-up questions, or Megan, any questions that you have for us?
No questions.
All right.
What is the, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What do you think is the most challenging aspect of being on this committee?
That's a great question. I don't know. I guess I can think about like some of the things that are challenging from a city council seat about like the decision side of things. Of course, planning board is advisory, and I think that brings a separate set of challenges. Sometimes from a council standpoint, it's challenging to have maybe something complies with the law and complies with Montana's a very property rights centric state, and sometimes our regulations are maybe something complies with our regulations, but it's not well liked, or there's controversy around it, and navigating all of that can be challenging. Remaining objective can be just that can all be a little challenging. There's a couple hands up from others. Heather and Amber and Brian, you can all chime in as well.
I think one of the things I'd like you to just be aware of is that what planning board hears from the public is oftentimes very different than what council hears from the public. I know the public can attend planning board meetings, but I don't know if they have the same all council email that gets filled up with constituent concerns. And so I guess my one comment would be, it is an advisory role, and we always appreciate what comes out of planning board, but do take into consideration that a lot of the complaints about development come oftentimes from neighbors who are concerned about the disruption and change that might be happening in their neighborhood, and they don't necessarily take into account the full needs of our entire community and trying to meet those needs.
Brian or Amber?
Go ahead, Amber.
Well, oh, did you say go ahead? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that you hit on it, honestly, Megan, a bit in your interview. I mean, I think that it's just that there are, there's not we wouldn't even need a planning board if it was as simple, we're going to put 10% here and 5% here and 10% there. I mean, that's not how it works. And that's not, it's taking in all the factors, that you can think of in those decisions. And I think there are competing interests for land, and it is a finite resource. And so I just think balancing the things that you've talked about to me, I've never sat on the planning board, but to me feels like what would be the most difficult challenge of it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of the themes during the interview, Megan, and particularly your recognition around change is hard. Change is hard. It's hard for folks all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably universal. And I can only imagine that this is, I don't want to say thankless, because I'm very thankful for what you do. But I can imagine that it's challenging and a lot of work, and there's probably a lot of heartache associated with it for a lot of folks. But I think it's going to be really, really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I hate to cut us off. We're butting up against the end of our time here, so we need to wrap up. But like I said, we will be back in touch in a couple weeks after. It'll be the first think the first Monday in May, when everything will get through the full council. And we very much appreciate your interest and your service on the subdivision and TED review working group, and thanks again.
Thank you so much. You guys have a great day.
You too. Thank you. Okay, our next interviewee should be here in just a moment, and we'll just go ahead and recess again for just a moment. Okay, I think we can come back into order here. We have our next applicant here, and Erin, I'm going to promote you to a meeting panelist so you can unmute and turn on your camera. Just a moment.
Hello.
Hi, Erin. Nice to see you. How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Great, thank you. So we have most of the Land Use and Planning Committee, a subset of the council here today, and of course this is an interview for an alternate position on the Missoula City County Consolidated Planning Board. And I have I'll just run through the questions. We normally do a round robin kind of thing, but it's a little bit clunky on Zoom. So I'll just run through the questions, and it should be pretty straightforward. And then at the end, there's an opportunity for you to ask us any questions that you have as well. So are you all set?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Great. So first of all, just please introduce yourself and feel free to highlight any useful experiences, knowledge, or perspectives that you would bring to the planning board.
Yeah, totally. Hello, everyone. My name is Erin. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Senior Organizing Manager for Forward Montana and Forward Montana Foundation. I've been with that organization for 3 years now, the same amount of time that I've been in Missoula. And I have been involved in housing conversations in Missoula within a month after I moved here when the WERWATH report dropped, and I just kind of dove headfirst into all of the things. And so I joined the Missoula Home Coalition that summer when it was formed, and have been a part of the leadership team in that coalition for about a year now. And we work with people from all across the housing sectors, nonprofits, developers, and really just trying to figure out, I mean, we're still trying to figure out our goals as a coalition, but really working in how we can educate everyone in Missoula around housing policy and make housing policy super accessible to everyone. And I just have a really strong passion for advocating for affordable housing and also just recognizing what we're able to do, as a municipality, what we're able to do as a state, and really trying to find a middle ground of what's possible. And I'm really excited to, well, I've been with Forward Montana at least trying to connect young people, especially to be in these decision-making tables and to advocate for policy that they want, and just figuring out how we can give young people the tools to talk about housing. And so I've been, I've just been involved in various aspects of housing for about 3 years now.
Great, thank you. So the planning board advises the city council and the board of county commissioners on land use issues. Planning board members are asked to weigh in on the growth policy, the zoning ordinance, and subdivision regulations. What about this work appeals to you, and are there any particular issues that you hope to address?
Yeah, I think I am incredibly fascinated by community planning and housing and development. I think that's probably my biggest area of interest when it comes to government and just local policy. So I think I was really involved in, commenting on A Place to Call Home and in the development of that plan. I participated in the downtown master plan. I was just in the Envision West Broadway conversations over a few weeks ago. And so I'm fascinated by all of that. I think it's really exciting to see how we can, map out the community that we want and really be able to create the conditions that allow for the type of housing we want, and also that the community wants, and being able to kind of shift these puzzle pieces to figure out what works is just really, really fascinating to me. So repeat the second part of the question.
Are there, you've touched on this a little bit, but are there, the first part was, what about this work appeals to you? And then the second part was, are there particular issues that you hope to address?
Oh, yeah. I think, I'm always, affordable housing is at the top of my list. But again, how we can do that in a way that makes sense for everyone, because you have to bring everyone to that conversation. It can't just be one voice over anyone else, no matter what that voice is. So I think, that's definitely a priority of mine, but really figuring out how we can engage Missoula and broader community members in that conversation, but in a very educational, impactful way. I know the past year has been a lot of the past multiple years have been a lot of folks, really angry and upset and coming at you all with a lot of emotion, which is totally fair. And I think I'm really interested to see, how we can really increase that educational side of things. And so that folks are I know what's going on. I know what this policy means for me specifically, and also my neighbors, and here's my thoughts on it. And here's how I want to speak on that to council. So I think I'm really interested in that educational piece and figuring out how we can, utilize things like Engage Missoula to be more functional for everybody. So.
Sure, thanks. Rezoning requests can be very contentious. Can you please describe your approach to reviewing a development proposal that seems to comply with the growth policy and relevant regulations, but is opposed by a large amount of testimony to the planning board? How would you weigh testimony geographically and otherwise?
Yeah, totally. I think that it's actually interesting. I remember Councilwoman Gwen Jones came to one of our internship classes a few years ago and talked about how, you know, there are policies that people don't like, but if it meets the growth policy and it meets, you know, what we're legally able to do, sometimes we just have it has to go through. Like if there's nothing wrong with the policy and it meets, you know, again, it meets everything that we're trying to do, but folks aren't happy, we all ultimately tend to have to pass those types of things. And I really agree with that in the sense of weighing all of the options. I think especially if it falls within the growth policy, it should take priority. And I have contentious conversations for my job every day, so I would be like really motivated to be hearing people, you know, hearing all sides of an issue and really hearing who is most impacted by that specific rezoning or that like specific development project. And I think I would definitely weigh the people who are most impacted first. Like if it's, you know, I'm getting kicked out of my house, or this rezoning, you know, affects my ability to continue this project that I've been working on for a few years. I think I would definitely weigh those heavier. But that being said, I mean, if thinking about what's the best for the community, I think would ultimately be like where I stand on the issue, what's best for the community and also what fits within the current policy and procedures and what's feasibly able to be done. I think those two things would kind of be similar weight.
Okay, great. A major tenet of our Missoula growth policy is the concept of focusing inward. The idea of focus inward is to direct new development into already developed areas of the community where services, employment centers, shopping, schools, and infrastructure already exist. Can you please describe the trade-offs between infill development and greenfield development?
Yeah, and just to clarify, greenfield development is any development that's outward, you know, on open space.
Yeah, typically, you know, developing on open space or agricultural land, kind of at the fringes of the community.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a lot of room for that in general in Missoula, unfortunately, and we're just kind of our hands are tied in that way. So, I mean, definitely in Missoula specifically, the benefits of infill and you know higher density within town is way more beneficial than trying to expand to land we potentially just don't have access to or isn't able to be developed. And I also want us to have green spaces and space outside of town that isn't developed as well. So I think I would definitely want to I definitely support that prioritization as far as utilizing infill zoning and going upward and kind of figuring out how we can. And I think the Envision West Broadway plan actually is. I'm really excited about how that is, you know, talking about businesses on the first floor with, you know, apartments and places for folks to live above. I think that's just such a great direction that we need to be going in. So.
Great. There's a couple follow-ups to this. You've touched on them, but I'll go ahead and read them. So first of all, is infill development a good idea? And if so, do you have any thoughts on how to encourage or incentivize infill?
Yeah, I do, you know, I do think infill development is a great idea. I will say I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky, and we didn't have mountains. We still don't have mountains over there. So I will say that when I moved here, I was like, okay, I get it. I get that people don't want to block their view. In fact, I live right on 5th Street, and when we moved into our apartment, we had a great view of the river and the mountains, and someone built a house right in between it. And we were like, well, that lasted for a good 2 months, and that was great. And so I totally get people's hesitation for that and not wanting these, you know, skyscraper or really tall buildings taking over the valley. And so I mean, yeah, at the end of the day, though, I think it's important. We have to house people. We can't just go on not being able to house every, you know, one of our community members. And so I really try to see and empathize with everyone, because I get, especially, you know, these folks who have lived here for their entire lives, for 30, 40, 50 years, who have seen Missoula drastically change so much already, and they're just like, this is enough, I can't take any more, don't add another apartment complex on my block, please. And so I think really having these conversations with those people, like it's going to need more conversations, I think, is the answer. And I know I trained the canvassing team that went out and canvassed some Missoula neighborhoods for, I forget which housing study, but I think it was back in 2019. And I remember they were really excited about it. And so many people that they talked to really hadn't had an in-depth conversation around their thoughts on housing. And the grad students said it was just, oh, it was so great to hear that, they want to talk about housing, like they're really interested and they really have a vision for their neighborhood. And so I would love to see some type of broader canvassing effort or like survey effort to really capture what people's fears are, because I think a lot of times the root of their concern around higher density and infill is often like more emotional, I think, than logistical. And so I think it's important though to weigh that and to have their opinions be heard.
Sure. Okay, thanks. Contrast that with greenfield development. What factors should be considered for land use and growth in the urban fringe? That is land in the county, but adjacent to or near the city.
I never would have thought about any of the factors that should have been considered until the Suatep-Kane master plan. And I remember reading all the comments on the Engage Missoula site about all of the wildlife that lives out there. And there was just, paragraphs upon paragraphs of folks really concerned about the wildlife habitats being destroyed or moved and what that would mean. And that was just something that, again, I did not grow up around wide open spaces, and I just didn't even think that was a possibility. And so I think that's definitely a concern though, considering even just how far up we are in the South Hills, we're seeing like wolves, coyotes, I forget the canine that comes down, but we're seeing like deers and wildlife that are already infiltrating our space here because we're trying to expand so much. And so I think wildlife's definitely a concern. I think it's a huge concern for a lot of Missoulians. And yeah, again, just kind of preserving, like being able to have open space where people can go. And I know everyone's like, oh, we don't want to be Bozeman, we don't want to be Denver, we don't want to have just eons of apartment complexes. And I hear that, but I also, again, I'm always going to come back to, we need to house people too. And so I get the aesthetics, and if it's just about aesthetics, then I'd be more inclined to say, well, let's figure out how we can make this work. And I think the master plan processes that I've been involved in, they're always wanting to prioritize trails and green spaces. But also, I think the biggest concern around county land outside of the city is will Mountain Line go to that, or will we be able to promote sustainable transportation into the city center from those areas? And I think that's probably the highest concern on my list with that.
Okay, thanks. The Our Missoula growth policy was adopted with broad public support, but in contrast, the planning board and the city council have reviewed numerous developments that actualize the growth policy in concept, but are very contentious in practice. Why do you think this is the case?
Yeah, I think I know when I had numerous conversations with people around a place to call home and the growth policy. I remember a lot of housing folks, thought, oh, this is great. And a lot of housing folks said, this doesn't go nearly as far as it needs to, this doesn't really meet the urgency of the situation. And I think that is what I'm always hearing from just community members that I'm talking to that maybe aren't in housing is, well, what the heck? Like, why are we not doing more? Like, this is a crisis. We got to go. This requires really intense policy shifting and urgent action. And I think I try to play the middle ground of, government only works in the way it does. And of course, things can change and we want to push for faster action, but there's just a lot of ways that, your all's hands are tied. And it's, well, to answer the question originally, I think that, I think that people are just in the midst of this crisis. And I think, as a renter, my rent's going up $200 in June. And I called my rental place and I said, well, just let me know, is my house being sold? Tell me what I should be expecting. And they said, well, you'll expect a $200 increase. And I said, okay. And I think, I'm fortunate that I'm able to just absorb that and just take it as a loss and move on. But I think it's hard for me to say, okay, government can move slow, development moves slow. I mean, we can't, have 100 apartment home overnight where, that's actually a good building and safe and all of that stuff. And so I think there's just that sense of urgency that people feel that they need, and wanting to live in a community that they can afford and thrive in, but just feeling like, what are we doing? And unfortunately, I think a lot of what you all are currently doing is really like not being seen or not being known about. So I think people are like, nothing's happening, nothing's moving. I'm not seeing anything. I'm not seeing a direct change to my rent, so nothing's happening. And I think there could be a lot more education around what is happening in the projects that are going up.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess as a follow-up to that too. So if the growth policy had several hundred, the growth policy broadly calls for densifying and broadly calls for infill and oftentimes the planning board might see a rezoning request that does create density and does create opportunities for additional housing stock, and then see broad public pushback. So sort of the other side of the coin of I don't want my neighborhood to change. I don't want this additional development. So how would you reconcile sort of the theoretical support for density and for infill and for housing development with sort of the on the ground opposition at the project level?
Yeah, that feels like the $1 million question. I know in Missoula, in the Missoula Home Coalition, we've grappled with this for literally years now. Of do you support all development? Do you just support affordable development? How do we need to be communicating with the city around this? And of course, in this planning board, it's not really about what's my personal opinion. It's kind of about what does this growth policy do, and how is it going to affect the community. And so I think I'm really in the camp of like, when we can create affordability, that's great, and when we can create something that fits the growth policy but also is prioritizing affordability, even better, and that would be something that I would want to prioritize. But I mean, the statistics are, we just need more places, we just need more development, and we need more development in the market. And so I think I would say to that, how can we push for this to be affordable? How can we push for this to meet the needs of the community, of the neighborhood that it's going into? What is the developer looking to get out of this? Like, what, kind of all of those, I would weigh all of the facets of that plan. And again, I think it really does come down to that communication piece the education piece within the community of, what does this project look like? And I know this board sets public hearings as well, and figuring out, is there, how can we have the public more educated on a development earlier? I know that can get kind of sticky with what you all are needing to do, and maybe that's not feasible, but how can we have the public weigh in earlier and really see, like, okay, well, this community is wanting X, Y, and Z for this development, and can the planning board work with that developer to see, is that a possibility? Like, how is there a way to find a middle ground within that? And I think the education piece of what this actually means for you or for your neighbors, instead of just, oh, there's this development, and just all of the fear that creates with people. So
yeah, absolutely. Can you describe the relationship between land use and transportation as you see it?
Oh, yeah. I think they're directly intertwined. I think I forget the person who's in charge of the bike and ped group, Ben Weiss, I think.
Yeah.
I watched a presentation he did a few years ago, and I left being like, I need to be a community planner. What the heck? I need to be thinking about transportation and how housing works together. And I really enjoyed listening to him talk about how, kind of what I mentioned earlier, where if you're building, people will not communicate, people will move in whatever vehicle they're like land around them whatever, that sentence went haywire. But if you're in an area where there's only roads and there's no sidewalks, and you're 10 miles from downtown, you're going to drive. You're going to just do what your environment is telling you to do as far as transportation. But if you have bike paths and it's safe to bike from the Mullen area to downtown, like you're more likely to bike. And if you have the resources to get a bike, you're more likely to do that, or walking or driving or whatever sustainable transportation. So I think they're directly linked. And I mean, even just looking at the north side, west side, where there's so few sidewalks, and it's hard to kind of walk there, with a stroller, or even in the university district where I live, it's not easy necessarily to get around, depending on how the sidewalks are leveled or what's going on. And so I think it directly is tied to how that community moves and moves within their own neighborhoods, and what methods of sustainability that they're using to travel by. So
great, thanks. Are there changes that you would like to see in how the planning board does business, or in the laws that it applies?
I was looking at the makeup of the current board, and I was assuming there would be a lot more developers on the board, and of course there may be more than I'm thinking, but I'm not really sure exactly what the planning board has had a say in necessarily. I've been to so many city council meetings, and it would be interesting to look back and see, oh, that was the planning board that was instrumenting whatever it was. But I think that figuring out how to get, it looks like the planning board was made up of a lot of people from various backgrounds, which I was really excited about. But just, thinking about how we're working with developers and with realtors, and making sure that they are at the table from the beginning. And I know there's so many community groups that are really passionate about housing, but how we can get them just I guess how we can just make these, more folks on the same page, more education around what city policy looks like, what it can look like in an ideal world. So in short, I'm not sure, but I think I really like the idea of just bringing more people to the table, and having, just people weigh in on various issues.
Thanks. A couple just logistics questions, then we'll turn it over to you for any questions you have. First, the planning board meets on the first and third Tuesdays of each month, and in recent months they've been adding occasional additional meetings, but also on Tuesdays. And those meetings begin at 7 p.m. Does your schedule generally accommodate this meeting time and do you generally have time to review the staff report or other materials prior to meetings?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. And then, as you know, this is an alternate position. Planning board alternate members attend meetings and participate in discussions like full members, but they only vote when there's an absence among full members. And I just want to confirm that you're willing to serve as an alternate.
Yep, totally.
Okay. Great. So that's the end of our formal questions. And if any of my colleagues have follow-up questions, we'd be happy to take those. And then Erin, if you have any questions for us, we have a few minutes. Erin, why don't we just jump in? If you have, I can see hands coming up here. So if you have any follow-up questions, just jump in, or any questions for us, go right ahead.
Yeah, I think my biggest question is, given the makeup of the current board, what are you all looking for? What kind of expertise is missing on the board? And what would your, what would this ideal board member look like to you all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can't speak for the whole committee. I think diversity of perspectives is really important. The planning board actually is structured pretty well as far as having, so council has a couple of appointees, and the mayor has appointees, and then the county commissioners have appointees, and then the conservation district has an appointee. So I mean, it's kind of a broad range of perspectives that appoint, the planning board does, most things that come to the city that are planning board items are rezones or changes to our zoning code, or things like reviewing the master plans to recommend them for adoption. But there's a whole swath of things that don't come to council that go to the county commissioners that the planning board also looks at. So sort of a mix of urban and rural, sort of a mix of, like you mentioned, there are a couple of people with sort of developer type tendencies, but contrast that with there's city appointees that are, that are really focused on Eggland and focused on, there's an appointee that just, there's actually a vacancy that we just had with someone that had a real land use planning background. So I would say diversity of opinions and diversity of expertise is a big qualification. And then I would also say for me, just a willingness to a willingness to remain objective, in the face of whatever might come forward. Those are probably the biggest qualities on to me. Anyone else want to weigh in there? Or, Amber, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Aaron. Yeah, so I actually was going to say almost exactly what you said there at the end. I think that what I'm looking for in an advisory board, and I feel like, as I said during all my campaigning, none of us on this council are experts in everything. We all have fields that we have been in and that we understand more thoroughly, but we rely on these advisory boards to give us good advice. So I think that, as Jordan said, I think just having a diverse board and having a board that is collaborative, working with each other, not digging their heels in for one issue, because all of this is very intertwined. And, if you give someplace else, you take from someplace else a bit. So I think kind of someone that can weigh all those issues and have an objective opinion is really important to me.
Yeah, Stacy?
Ditto everything everyone else has said, but I also think it's really important to understand the various decision-making spaces that both we on City Council as well as the Board of County Commissioners have. I think that I can speak for most of us on council that land use and planning and the decisions behind that are some of the more complicated ones that we have to deal with, and the ones where and like in the example that you gave with when highlighting how it is, the criteria we have to follow, the laws we have to follow, and that, we can't just deny a project because we don't like it. We have to have legal findings of fact. And so kind of understanding those constraints from the get-go and how we make decisions and kind of the box that we're in. It's not lack of creativity on our part, it's just the rules and the law. And a lot of times that is hard to communicate with folks, especially if they're worried about the change that it brings to their, a community space that they really care about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Brian, you want to add anything?
Yeah, just building on all of those comments, our land use decisions at council are quasi-judicial decisions. And they're fundamentally sort of different because they're quasi-judicial, decisions. And so, I really value, I think all council really values the input we get from planning board. Planning board is one of those boards where it's really critical. I know I pay a lot of attention to the rationale and the votes. And so specifically what I was going to add is clear articulation around, support, probably more important, frankly, when in opposition to something. Oftentimes we'll see stuff that maybe has, overwhelming or unanimous support from the planning board. And in that case, I think it's probably less important. It's pretty clear from that something meets the various criteria, et cetera. It's where things are closer votes or don't pass that I find it really valuable to hear from the planning board members so that it can be summarized by staff to us, what the distinct, clear articulation of, a planning board member's no vote was on something.
Yeah. That's a really good point, Brian. And I'm really glad you brought that up. Because oftentimes things that come to the planning board, 95, probably 99% of the time have a motion or a recommendation from staff. By the time they get to the planning board, the staff have worked with the applicant enough to get it to the point where the staff recommend that it passes. And so if the staff believe that it complies with the law and the planning board makes a recommendation against something, it's really extremely helpful to have that clear articulation of why the planning board disagrees with the staff recommendation. So, yeah. Do you have any other questions for us, Erin?
Is there time?
Yeah, we have a couple minutes.
Yeah, I think my other question would just be, you know, how, I guess, how has the planning board shifted in the last few years, kind of given everything that's been happening, like with the growth policy, and how has that looked? I mean, has there been a lot of contentious, you know, back and forth, or is it kind of, as you said, Jordan, like their objective, and they're not focusing on, you know, who's right, who's wrong, who's like wanting different things. Have they been able to stay, you know, in that lane of this is our job, or has there been more, I don't know, just more debates and things recently?
I would say that they have very spirited discussions. I mean, planning board meetings are always really they're really thorough. They bring great perspective. And I would say, like, by and large, they do a really good job of kind of framing everything through the lens of what the decision is that they're allowed to make. Or sometimes highlighting things that are maybe outside of the decision space, but ought to be highlighted and ought to be brought into light in some way. If that, does that answer your question?
Yeah. And I will say that I think my work with Forward Montana is very similar to what Stacey was describing, where it's like figuring out how we stay in our lane and how we stay within the system, and how things are currently operating, and figuring out how we can go outside of it. But just, we ultimately have to stay within our lane. So I can empathize with that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we are scheduled to wrap up at 3:30, so I want to respect everyone's time, but really appreciate your interest, Erin, and your application. We have 2 more interviews that we'll be doing, I believe, next week, and then so it'll be probably the first council meeting in May on May 3rd that we'll have a final decision on the seat. So you won't hear from us for a little while, but expect to hear from us sometime in early May. So
awesome. Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And while the committee is here, we have a quorum, so we'll go back to our approval of the minutes. Are there any changes to those? Heather?
Not related to this topic, Jordan.
Okay, so those will be, the minutes are passed then, and Heather?
Jordan, I was wondering, thinking about the membership of this planning board. So first off, I want to just note that when I look online, it looks like all of the people on planning board have their terms ending at the end of this year. Is that accurate? Okay.
Is that relative
It
to?
says so.
Is that everyone, or is that just the council appointee, or?
Everyone.
Okay, I might need to look into that. That should not be accurate, but I don't think.
Okay. And then my other thought is, considering how important planning is, I also note that we don't have any very specific occupations that need to be part of the membership like we do with other boards and committees. Is there a way that we can obtain a list of occupations of our existing planning board members, just so that we can try and get some diversification of occupations?
I can ask and see if we can get that.
Okay, I appreciate that.
And I'll look in. I'm just looking at the website now, and that does seem odd. I'm sure that that's not quite right about this. The terms are staggered. I believe.
Yeah.
I want to say that they're 2 or 3 year terms. They're 2-year terms, and they should be staggered. So we can take a look at that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else before we adjourn? Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for staying a few minutes extra. Have a great day.